So, it's to do with prophecy today, and the end-time prophecies we want to look at. Now, there are many end-time prophecies. The Old Testament is full of them. There are end-time prophecies also in the New Testament. But we thought we'd look at the end-time prophecies concerning the order of events that will take place at Christ's return. So we hope to sort of show chronologically in order from the prophets what Christ will do when he returns. So that's the idea. So, first of all then, the first thing Christ does when he returns is to raise the responsible dead. We say responsible dead because he's not going to raise everybody. We shall see that in a moment. And so we see that Isaiah prophesies in chapter 26, verse 19. He says, "Thy dead men shall live, together with my dead body shall they arise. Awake and sing, ye that dwell in dust. For thy dew is as the dew of herbs, and the earth shall cast out the dead." But not all the dead will be raised, as we see when we look at verse 14. There it speaks of another class. It says, "They are dead; they shall not live. They are deceased; they shall not rise. Therefore hast thou visited and destroyed them, and made all their memory to perish." So the resurrection is actually a resurrection to the judgment seat. We'll come to that point. And it's those who are responsible to that judgment that will be raised to see, as Paul says in Corinthians, to receive in body that which they have done, whether it be good or bad. So those raised shall be judged, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:10. He says, "For we must all appear." Remember, he's writing to the believers. The believers will be amongst those raised. They will be, because they're responsible, they know what they should have been doing. And he's writing to the believers at Corinth. He says, "We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad." So the believers will receive either good or bad in their bodies, depending how they are judged at the judgment seat of Christ. Now, the indications are that the judgment seat is likely to be in the mountains of Sinai. It's a secluded place, and it will be even more secluded perhaps at the time, and therefore the judgment will take place unbeknown to the world at large. Those who are accepted at the judgment, they are referred to as the saints. All believers, true believers, are referred to as saints in the Bible, in the New Testament in particular. The believers are always addressed as saints, which means sanctified ones or separated ones, which believers are. And the marriage supper for those accepted is to be immediately after the judgment seat. So that will also be in the mountains of Sinai. In the book of Revelation, we read, therefore, concerning the marriage supper, verse 7 and 8, "Let us be glad and rejoice, and give honour to him, for the marriage of the Lamb," which is a figure for Christ, because the book of Revelation is given in sign and symbol. "The marriage of the Lamb is come, and his wife, which is the bride of Christ," the believers, hath made herself ready." Verse 8, "And to her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white, for the fine linen is or represents the righteousness of the saints or believers." So we have the marriage supper of the Lamb then, in the mountains of Sinai when Christ returns, after he's conducted the judgment seat. And also in Revelation, we read chapter 19, verse 9, "He saith unto me, Right, blessed are they which are called unto the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he saith unto me, These are the true sayings of God." So that is somebody's depiction on the screen of what the marriage supper of the Lamb might look like in the mountains of Sinai. The fourth event is the overthrow of Israel's hostile neighbours, their immediate neighbours. There's quite a number of things got to happen before Christ establishes his rule upon the earth. Psalm 83 tells us quite a lot about this, so we can consider this for a little while. Verses 1 to 3, we read, "Keep not thou silence, O God. O God, hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones." We're using the King James Version normally, but we also consult other translations sometimes to get perhaps a clearer picture sometimes. Now, the phrase hidden ones in the New King James says sheltered ones, and in the Revised Version, it renders it as protected ones. In other words, the Jews in the land at that time will be, perhaps unbeknown to them and the world, they will be, as it were, protected somewhat once Christ is in the earth. As I say, initially, people will not know Christ is in the earth. It will all be conducted initially in the mountains of Sinai. Now, these hostile nations, in verses 1 to 3, we read verse 4, "They have said, Come and let us cut them off," that is Israel, "from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance." Now, that's quite interesting, because the name of Israel as a nation state went out of existence. It went out of existence about 700 BC, when the Assyrians took the 10 northern tribes captive, and what was left was the kingdom of Judea. And so the name of Israel has been out of existence for at least 2,600 years. Now, for 2,600 years, there was therefore no name of Israel as a name of a nation state to be cut off in that region. Until, of course, the state of Israel was declared in 1948. It's interesting to read the events of that occasion, because until it was announced, the people did not know what the name was going to be. They were going to announce the independence of the new state, but no one knew, would it be called Judea, like it was in the days of Jesus? And so they were all very thrilled when Ben-Gurion declared it to be the new independent state of Israel. After 2,600 years, there's a state of Israel to be cut off, it seems, in the minds of some. And it's only since the Turks were driven out of the Middle East in 1918 that sovereign states have arisen around Israel. It was simply, all the Middle East was simply a province or provinces of the Ottoman Empire. But after 1918, when the Turks were driven out, the sovereign states were established, such as Iraq and Syria, Lebanon and Jordan. Now, some of them are threatening to cut off from being a nation the state of Israel. So now is the era for this psalm to be fulfilled. The next verse, verse 5, "For they are consulted together with one consent, they are confederate against thee." So it's a confederacy. And then it lists the nations in the confederacy. Now it uses the biblical terms like Edom, Moab, Ammon, and so forth. But we only need, as it were, a Bible atlas to show what these states are today. Edom, Moab, and Ammon is the state of Jordan, the kingdom of Jordan, for instance. Now, Psalm 83 goes on to list, therefore, the peoples who will form the confederacy against Israel. Now, a well-known Bible commentary of the late 19th century, edited by C.J. Ellicott, D.D., correctly observed this. It says, "It is impossible to refer this psalm, Psalm 83, to any known period of Israelite history." It's yours, Jim.
Muted it and everything.
Okay. So it is impossible to refer this psalm to any period of Israelite history. No, he's right. All through the Bible we get most of Israel's history, and nothing like this has ever been. A confederacy as the one going to be listed in the next verses has never been organized against Israel. So there is indeed no record of such a confederacy, but C.J. Ellicott wrongly concludes from this that therefore this psalm must be simply poetical exaggeration. Seeing as it's never happened, it must just be poetical exaggeration. But of course the Psalms, what Ellicott is omitting to realise is the Psalms are actually the inspired word of God. Yes, written in poetry, employing a skillful play on similar sounding words, but the content is infallible, infallibly accurate, such that if the Lord says in Psalm 83, such and such will be so, it will be so. So we can only conclude then that as this prophecy has not yet been fulfilled, it is yet to be fulfilled. And since it could not be fulfilled for 2,600 years, because there was no state of Israel to be cut off, now it can be. And so we see now that it relates to the present situation in the Middle East. The next verse, verse 6. We read there, it says, it lists the confederacy against Israel, the tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites, of Moab and the Hagarenes. Now, the Ishmaelites and the Hagarenes, they were largely nomadic, but they had their roots, their trade routes, and they plied their trade and eventually dwelt along the route, as it were. They dwelt along the Fertile Crescent, that is, the trade, we'll just have a pointer here, I think, if we can get it to work. Yeah. So they would travel from Egypt, they would go through Israel, they would carry on, following the Fertile Crescent, because this is desert round here, and trade with the eastern nations there. And then they began to settle in those areas of Syria. So the Ishmaelites and the Hagarenes therefore plied their trade and dwelt along the Fertile Crescent and in the southeast of Lebanon, and they built towns also in southwest Syria. So that's the region that seems to be referred to by the Ishmaelites, the parts of Lebanon and Syria. Now Syria and parts of Lebanon are thus identified as being in the Confederacy, but Syria, and the Hebrew for Syria is Aram, is not mentioned. It's not mentioned in the English version or the Hebrew original as Aram. It's not mentioned in this Confederacy. So it suggests that Syria will parts of Syria, as we know it today, will be in the Confederacy. It suggests perhaps that Syria will not exist as it does on the map at present, that it will be broken up, so to speak, because another name place is used, and that is Ashur, or Assyria. We'll come to this in a moment. So that's interesting. The turmoil in those parts of Syria and Iraq could be, as it were, leading up to a different arrangement there in the Middle East. And so Assyria, or Ashur, was an empire comprising parts of today's Syria and parts of Iraq, which to me suggests that the states of Syria and Iraq are going to be radically changed to allow for this new order of things in the territory of Assyria. We must also take note that in all this confederacy, Egypt is not included. So Egypt will not be one of the nations trying to cut off Israel. Edom and Moab, which we have, there we have them again, Edom and Moab, they correspond to the present-day state of Jordan. Also Ammon, which is mentioned in the next verse, I think, is in the state of Jordan. So the state of Jordan will be, the kingdom of Jordan will be against Israel in that day. The next verse, verse 7, it tells us Gebal or Jebel, and Ammon. There we have Ammon now, that's the northern part of Jordan, and Amalek. Also the Philistines, with the inhabitants of Tyre. These are in the Confederacy. Now, Gebal or Jebel, if my eyes can see this, is up here, I think. I think it's the Gebal, also known as Byblos. And so there are areas of Lebanon, not the whole state of Lebanon, but areas, perhaps the Palestinian areas, the Muslim areas, because it's a mixed faiths in Lebanon, will be in the Confederacy. Also Tyre, well, we have Tyre today, and I think we can see Tyre. I think we'll use it's a bit hard, that one. We'll use this pointer here. Have we got Tyre? That's Tyre there. So We have Tyre and Jebel, the inhabitants around that. I think a lot of Palestinians used to be in Tyre, whether I think they're still there. So there's areas which will join the confederacy against Israel. Ammon and Moab, and that's Moab there, and Edom is the kingdom of Jordan. They will be foremost in the confederacy. We get the Philistines as well. That's the Gaza Strip. So around this area here, we know Gaza is very hostile generally to Israel, and they're virtually independent. We only need to consider Amalek, which is slightly difficult because they were largely nomadic, Amalek. So we find that Amalek is also mentioned in, amongst other places, Judges chapter 12, verse 15 there. It just says in passing about the Amalekites, it says, "And Abdon, the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, died and was buried in Pirathon in the land of Ephraim in the mount of the Amalekites." Now, he was actually buried in Ephraim, which today is called the West Bank. Ephraim and Samaria, of biblical times, is now referred to as the West Bank, or occupied territories, which the Palestinians want to have as an independent state of Palestine, this sort of area here. So it seems that in ancient times, this area was also known as the Mount of the Amalekites, so they must have had a lot to do with it. And perhaps it's the Bible's way of telling us that the West Bank will be in the confederacy against Israel. The next verse, verse 8, it says Asher. We've also already mentioned Asher. Asher, or Assyria, as we call it in English, also is joined with them. They have holpen the children of Lot. Children of Lot were Moab and Ammon. So Moab and Ammon are in Jordan. So it seems that this confederacy is to help Jordan in some way, shape or form against Israel. And Asher, we have it on this map here. Now this map is depicting how things were about, 1100 BC. Now the psalm was written around about 1000 BC. So it would have been approximately as it is on this map. So Asher had already, Asher is a city, that's Asher there, I think it is, but it gave its name to the empire of Assyria, which was at different extensions at different periods. Eventually it was the First World Empire. It eventually occupied the whole of Egypt and the Middle East, and so it's known in history as the First World Empire, the Assyrio-Babylonian Empire. But that was not the case 1000 BC. 1000 BC, it was an empire, but not that big. So we see that this is the territories of Iraq and Syria. So if there's to be a latter-day Assyrian state, so to speak, it seems to be carved out of part of Iraq and part of Syria, if that's the case. If we just move on to this map here, this shows the extent that ISIS got to. It's shrinking now, of course, but this is the extent they got to. We notice that these territories here are sort of similar to the old Asher, the old Assyria. Now, the reason why there's a lot of... We know that ISIS is being driven out of here, but the people driving them out, there are many factions fighting against ISIS, and they're all hoping to have this area for themselves as a Sunni state. So maybe they'll succeed. Maybe they'll eventually get this. It's unlikely that President Assad is ever going to get all this back. So if he stays in power, he'll only have the Shiite area, because he's a Shiite basically, an Alawite. He'll only have the Shiite area. This is Sunni. And so this will... And this again here is Sunni as well area, and Baghdad is Shiite. So it looks as though Iraq will lose their Sunni area, and Syria will lose their Sunni area, and it will be perhaps something approximating to the old Asher. Reading on, verses 9 and 10, Psalm 83. God says, having shown us the confederacy, says, the prophet appeals to the God of heaven, do unto them as unto the Midianites, as to Sisera, as to Jabin, at the brook of Kishon, which perished at Endor. They became as dung for the earth. Now, interestingly, this was the time of miracles. The biblical time was the time of miracles. It's not the time of miracles today. It's not been the time of miracles ever since the Holy Spirit was withdrawn in the 2nd century. No more miracles, no more scriptures being written, no more prophecies being written down. It all ended, and miracles will not come back till Christ returns. But at this point, Christ is in the mountains of Sinai. He's come back. He's conducted the judgment seat. He's conducting the marriage supper of the Lamb. So now we can have miracles like took place here. If we wanted to check up on what this is referring to, it's referring to Judges chapters 4 and 5, where Gideon and Barak, we'll come to Gideon in a moment, Barak, he was given a great victory by the hand of God over the Canaanites. And so it's saying, do the same again. So the psalmist here alludes to events recorded in Judges 4 and 5. We haven't time to go to them, but you can read them at home, of course. You're probably familiar with them. And thus indicates that those events were typical of the conflict yet to come, typical of Israel being overrun by Gentiles, and then by divine intervention, the Gentiles are destroyed, the invaders are destroyed. And that, by the way, the illustration on the previous one was Sisera, the captain of the Canaanite host, who was slain by a gale, the lady who drove a tent peg through his temples. So that's all in Judges 4 and 5. Then we have the other one also referred to in verses 11 regarding Oreb and Zeb. It says, verse 11, make their nobles like Oreb and like Zeb, yea, all their princes are Zeb and Zalmunna. That was Gideon who did that. And we find that in Judges 7 and 8. And this is a depiction of Gideon's method of overcoming the Midianites. Again, divine intervention saved Israel from annihilation. We're on to verse 12 now in Psalm 83. And it's referring back to the Midianites and so on, the time of Gideon and Barak, the enemies of Israel. In those days, they said, let us take to ourselves the houses of God in possession. But this is what's going to happen again. The nations around Israel are going to say, let us take to ourselves the houses of God in possession. Let's have this holy land for ourselves. After all, it's the third, Jerusalem is the third holy place in Islam. And so they're going to say, it belongs to us, we shall have it, we shall take it. So now, just as a matter of interest, where it says in the King James, the houses of God in possession, the phrase in the New King James Version, or Revised Standard Version, New American Version, New Revised Standard Version says, the pastures of God. In other words, the land, the promised land. The New Jerusalem Bible says God's settlements. So clearly it is the land of Israel which is going to be coveted as it was in the past. That picture, by the way, was a photo of the Jezreel Valley, which it was the main theatre in the past when the surrounding nations in the days of Barak invaded the land. Reading on, verses 13 and 14. O my God, make them, the enemies, like a wheel, as the stubble before the wind, as the fire burneth the wood, as the flame setteth the mountains on fire. And verse 15, so persecute them with thy tempest, and make them afraid with thy storm. And I have some dramatic pictures here. Verse 16, 17, fill their faces with shame, that they may seek thy name, O Lord, and let them be confounded and troubled forever. Yea, let them be put to shame and perish, that men may know that thou, whose name alone is Jehovah, or Yahweh in the original, art the Most High over all the earth. So this is a way where God is going to show his presence in the earth, in the person, in that he sends the Son of God, Jesus, to establish his establish the kingdom on earth and pacify the nations so that the meek shall inherit the earth. So then, if we proceed a little further. Now, some in Israel are still willing to give up land. Israelis are still willing to give up land and militarily defensive positions, strategic positions that are advantageous to the defense. They're willing to give them up to get peace, a peace treaty, two-state solution. But Jerusalem is always the sticking point. The Palestinians said, no, we have Jerusalem as our capital. The Israelis said, no, that's our eternal capital. Never give that up. After Israel's neighbours have so burdened themselves with Jerusalem, a greater nation, greater nations will come down into the Middle East and also burden themselves with Jerusalem. And that will be the Battle of Armageddon. And so we just mentioned this now after the overthrow of the nations around Israel, the hostile nations. We then get an influx from the north of many nations. And it says, Zechariah, the prophet, chapter 12, verse 3, in that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces. They all want it, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it. Now this is what Christ calls in the book of Revelation, Armageddon. Revelation 16:16, and he gathered them together into a place called, in the Hebrew, notice, Hebrew tongue, Armageddon. Now the Revelation of John is presented to us in Greek, but it specifies here that the place name is a Hebrew place, and it is to be found in the land. There is some dispute as to precisely where Armageddon is in the land of Israel, but all would agree that it's somewhere in Israel. There's two different ways of breaking down the name Armageddon. Some would say it's to do with the valley of Megiddo, and some would say it's to do with Jerusalem, one of the valleys in Jerusalem, but it's in Israel. That's the main point. So really, that is our part one, as it were, because if we attempted to deal with the rest, it would take us rather a long time today. So what we've looked at is that the first thing that occurs when Christ returns, according to the prophets, the end-time prophecies, is the resurrection of the dead. Of course, this is found also in the New Testament. It's found all over the scriptures, but we quoted Isaiah 26 to illustrate the point, the resurrection. That is not for everyone, but for those responsible to the judgment seat of Christ. So that the second thing he does, he brings them to the judgment seat of Christ, which we believe to be in the mountains of Sinai, and he judges them. Those who are found acceptable, the third thing then is to clothe them with divine nature and entertain them at the marriage supper of the Lamb. And then at this juncture is around about the time when the enemies of Israel, surrounding Israel, will be invading the land seriously. And divine intervention is necessary. And so, point 4, the overthrow of Israel's hostile neighbours. But it seems it will be done unseen, that the Christ and the saints will not appear at that time. They won't appear until later on, when the forces of the north come down for the Battle of Armageddon. Then they will appear on the scene. We'll come to it. But if we just want to see what's coming next time, which is in 2 weeks' time, God willing, we shall be considering stage 5, how that Russia is the king of the north and is going to be drawn down into the Middle East, how that many Jews will have fled into Egypt, and they will find, many Israelis will flee into Egypt, and they will find themselves trapped there because the Russian ruler will take Egypt. And therefore, it will mean a second exodus from Egypt will be required. And that's when Christ and the saints, the believers, who are now immortal, who will then be immortal, will go into Egypt and bring out the second time, as it were, a second exodus. They will dry up the Red Sea permanently at the crossing point and bring them across to the land. And then they will meet the Russian forces in the south of Israel. Christ and the saints will engage. The ruler is styled Gog in Ezekiel 38. They will meet Gog's forces at Bozrah in the south and defeat them. And then they will follow the route that Joshua took when he led the Israelites, Moses and Joshua, when they came up to the land of promise. They will go up the eastern side of the Dead Sea, and Christ and the saints will then cross the Jordan at Gilgal from the east, just like Joshua did. And then the ninth point, he will save the tents of Judah first. There will be some Israelis in Judah holding out, as it were, against the Russian forces. They will be saved first, and then they will come to Jerusalem and deliver Jerusalem, which will be besieged at the time. And then we get the great events of the Battle of Armageddon. But that is coming next, as it were. So we think it best to pause at this stage for a couple of weeks. Of course, it leaves us time for any comments or discussion that anyone may wish to say. Okay, so this is part 2, but you needn't worry if you miss part 1, because they all stand alone, these talks, basically. In part 1, we did consider the order of events when Christ returns, as prophesied in the Bible. So in part 1, we considered the resurrection of the dead, which is the first thing Christ does when he returns, and then the judgment seat of Christ, number 2. Number 3, the marriage supper, where the ones accepted are clothed with immortality and they have a feast with the Lord Jesus. And then number 4, we considered the prophecies regarding Israel's hostile neighbours, how by divine intervention at that point they will be overthrown in their attempts to destroy Israel. So that's where we got up to. Now, what we want to consider now is point number 5, how there will be another invasion of the Middle East, which will come from the north. Russia, spoken of in the Bible as the Prince of Rosh, or Rosh, and also the King of the North, will be drawn down into the Middle East, according to Bible prophecy. There will be then, Christ will be in the earth, and the immortalized believers, there will be a second exodus when they go into Egypt to bring out many Jews that have got trapped in Egypt by the Russian forces. And then the 7th point we hope to deal with before we run out of time is Christ and the saints will engage the Russian forces in the south of Israel, in Bozrah, as they come from Egypt with the Jews they brought out of Egypt and coming up towards Jerusalem. So that's as far as we hope to get today. So let's start with the... So then, this is what we are looking for. Now, Ezekiel 38, we'll keep coming back to this chapter because it is a chapter of the end times. In fact, also chapter 39 follows on, but we won't have time to look at that. And chapter 40 follows on, right to the end of the book of Ezekiel. It's all chronological from the return of Christ. But chapter 38 we shall be looking at today, and we find that in verse 2 it says, now just here we're quoting from the Young's literal translation, it says here, Son of man, set thy face unto Gog, of the land of Magog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy concerning him. Now, what are these places? Well, he's the Prince of Rosh. So we look at Rosh, and from Easton's Bible Dictionary, we gather that it is basically a name for Russia. In fact, we find that in Scandinavian and Germanic languages, they refer to Russia as Rushland, Rushland, the land of the Rush, the land of the Rush people, or Rosh, as we have it in the Bible. So Easton's Bible Dictionary, which has been around, I'm not sure exactly how long, it was probably getting on for 100 years now, I suppose. they're in agreement with us on this, and my own personal study is in agreement that this is definitely, this Prince of Rosh is definitely the ruler, the latter-day ruler of Russia. Easton's Bible Dictionary also says concerning Meshach, it says Meshach is equivalent to the Moshki, which is a term for the Muscovites. And Easton says they were in all probability the Moshki, or a people inhabiting the Moshkian mountains between the Black and Caspian Seas during the ascendancy of the Babylonians. So we're going back a long way now. We're going back 2,500 years to the Empire of Babylon, and then that was succeeded by the Persian Empire. The Babylonians and the Persians in Western Asia, the Moski were subdued by them, and it says, but it seems probable that a large number of them crossed the Caucasus range and spread over the northern steppes, mingling with the Scythians. There they became known as the Muscovs and gave that name to the Russian nation and its ancient capital, by which they are still generally known throughout the East. So apparently there's still some eastern areas that refer to the Russians as Muscovs, or certainly did so 100 years ago, Muscovs. And so basically it's Moscow. But not just Moscow, the city, it's Muscovy. That is the area, it's a region of the Russian Empire. And Moscow is the capital. And so basically, Easton's dictionary, and also my own personal studies independently of that, and others also that I've read their works, we do have a consensus that this Meshach refers to Moscovy, which is the European part or region of the Russian Empire. So we have Russia and Moscovy. So this Gog character is a prince of Russia and Moscovy, and also Tubal. Now, Easton's dictionary says concerning Tubal it refers to the Tabarini, or Tartars as they are known. They are Siberian tribes, and we do find that their historic capital was Tobolsk, and so that is Tobolsk. It's identifying Siberia, basically, the region of Siberia. So this latter-day ruler of Russia will be prince also of Muscovy and Siberia, which basically is the whole of the Russian Empire. It also mentions Magog, so we shall look at that also presently. Rosh, Muscovy, and Tobolsk, which you've seen, are within the present Russian Empire. But Magog was mentioned, and Magog is not in the Russian Empire. Magog is it approximates the tribes of Magog settled in the regions of Germany and Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. Now, these are not part of the Russian Empire at present. Now, Gog, the prince of Rosh, being credited in Ezekiel in the prophecy with Magog, would indicate a Russian invasion of the northern half of mainland Europe and Scandinavia. Now, when we look at the news today, I mean, this is not a new idea. This idea was put forward, first of all, in 1848 by John Thomas. And we've held this view of this prophecy for 40, 50 years. So it's not new. But nevertheless, these days, it looks closer to fulfillment. Russia is indeed today threatening the northern half of Europe. The Scandinavians now are opening up their nuclear bunkers to try and protect their civilization from nuclear war from Russia. This is how frightened they are of what Russia is aiming to do to northern Europe, northwest Europe. So, according to Ezekiel 38, it seems Russia will invade Germany, Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Scandinavia. Now, we have jumped a little here. We haven't explained about the Tarshish powers. We shall do that in due course, possibly next week. God willing. But we find that there's a reference in Ezekiel 38, the chapter that we're principally looking at the moment, to the merchants of Tarshish and the young lions thereof, which seems to relate to Britain, USA, Canada, Australasia. They will be in the Middle East, challenging the invasion of Russia when they come down into the Middle East. And if, of course, the Tarshish powers were to lose Europe, they would seek to strengthen their position to the south of the Russian Empire, which would be basically the Middle East. In which case, the ruler of Russia, styled here Gog, would be able to turn his attention to the Middle East, having secured Northern Europe by conquest, and Southern Europe we find by alliance. We'll come into that later. Urgency would be added to Gog's change of direction from Europe to the Middle East or to the south if a power vacuum had suddenly appeared or been created there by the overthrow of Israel's neighbours, as per Psalm 83, which we considered last time. So going back to that verse 2 in Ezekiel 38, verse 2, we read there, Son of man, set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog. So what is this Magog? We said it's the Germanic tribes of Northern Europe, but let's see what we can find on that. It seems that in Wikipedia, it's quite interesting. There's an article there, and most of this is from there. It seems that many descendants of Magog, who was a grandson of Noah, and those of his nephew Ashkenaz, migrated northwest after the flood and became known as the Scythians, the Western Scythians, a name derived from Ashkenaz, the nephew of Magog, great-grandson of Noah, comes from Ashkenaz. The stem word here is ski, and the stem word in Scythians or Scythians is ski. This is just a suffix signifying that they are of the ski people. So we find also that Isaac Asimov has proposed that biblical Ashkenaz, that we've read of in Genesis 10, arose, the name he thinks arose from Ashkuz, which is a name in ancient inscriptions for the Scythians, by an old misreading of Nun, the letter Nun in Hebrew, for the letter Vav. So here we have Ashkenaz as it appears in the Bible, that's the Hebrew spelling, and this is Ashkuz as they find on the inscriptions, ancient inscriptions relating to the Scythians. So you see there's not a lot of difference there. The Wikipedia article on Ashkenaz comments Ashkuz from the Scythians in Assyrian Akkadian inscriptions. So in the Assyrian Akkadian language, the Scythians are referred to as Ashkuz. So basically these people, they migrated to the west, northwest Europe. And what that signifies is that they mingled with the Magog people, so that when it says, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, it means that Gog by that time has occupied the territories of Magog, the Germanic tribes of northern Europe and Scandinavia. So then we find, if we want to look on the map, what it relates to. This is Russia, the Russian Empire, Muscovy, and basically Russia, according to the prophecy, will take the Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and certainly the biggest part of Germany. Perhaps they will avoid Bavaria and Belgium. Belgium's here. Certainly Holland will fall into the area of Magog. The Baltic states do also, and Finland, Sweden, Norway. So that is what Russia is up to according to Ezekiel 38. Going back to that same verse 2 of Ezekiel 38, it says, Son of man, set thy face unto Gog, of the land of Magog, prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal, and prophesy concerning him. So this character then, this prince of Russia, Gog, this is unlikely to be his real name. This is what the Bible refers to him as, because of the meaning of the word Gog. So when we look up the word Gog, we find it signifies a dynamic leader. And the principal meaning of Gog in ancient Hebrew is actually to blaze like fire, which would be a fitting description of this last ruler of Russia. But later usage, as it migrated into the Greek language, etc., relates to leadership. So we get, for instance, the Greek word synagogue, which is also in English. It's made up of sin, which means things brought together, and gog, which means to lead or to bring. So synagogue signifies to lead or bring people together to the synagogue. So that illustrates simply that this word Gog does signify leadership. And so it's a fitting title for this character because he's going to be a great military leader who will weld all the old world empires together. As per Daniel chapter 2, he will weld them all together, all the territories of the old four world empires. He will weld them all together briefly until he falls in the battle of Armageddon on the mountains of Israel. Now, the King James Version does not render it Prince of Rosh. The King James Version says the chief prince. Well, the mistake they've made is this word chief is Rosh. And they should have translated it or transliterated it as a proper name. And the modern translations do that. Most of the modern translations do that. So Prince of Rosh, or Rush, as we would say it today. And so the Prince of Rosh is the rendering also in the English Revised Version, Young's Literal, as we've seen, New King James Version, the New King James Version, the American Standard Bible, and many others. Rosh is, as we've seen, an ancient name for Russia. And as we've said, in the Germanic and Scandinavian languages, they say Rushland. And that's what Russia means, the land of the Rosh. Moving on to verse 5 of Ezekiel 38, it says some of the nations in alliance with Gog in that day. Persia will be in alliance with Gog. Well, we know that Persia's main ally is Russia. And vice versa. Ethiopia and Libya will also be his allies. They shall be with this host of Russians and Europeans coming down into the Middle East, all of them with armaments, shield and helmet. Persia, of course, we know it today as Iran. Ethiopia in the Hebrew is Cush. The online Bible lexicon says concerning Cush, the land occupied by the descendants of Cush, located around the southern parts of the Nile, which is the Sudan and Ethiopia today. So the Sudan and Ethiopia, the two nations directly south of Egypt, will be in alliance in that day with the Russians, along with Iran. We can make a note of that sensibly because Ethiopia and Libya, it says, will be his allies. We get this said also in Daniel 11, which we shall turn to presently. Libya, by the way, is in the Hebrew put. The word is put. An Easton's Bible Dictionary says, Libya, the country of the Ludim, northern Africa, a large tract lying along the Mediterranean to the west of Egypt. So it goes beyond present-day Libya. It could well include Algeria and Morocco and Tunisia. It would seem that northern Africa, bordering the Mediterranean, will be in alliance with the Russians in that day. But we know that Egypt is not on Russia's side, because Egypt is on the Tarshish power side, the British side, in that conflagration that is to come. Move on to verse 6. In the allies of Russia, or Gog, it says, verse 6, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togomar of the north quarters, and all his bands, and many people with thee. Wikipedia article states, we already referred to this article, it states concerning Gomer that it refers to the Gimmerai. the Gimmerai. And previously, that name has been associated with the Cimmerians. Moffat's translation of the Bible renders the Hebrew Gomer by Cimmerians, so that's how he sees it, which agrees, of course, with it does agree with the program on the Bible lexicon. So, which says as follows: Gomer, the eldest son of Japheth, the grandson of Noah, the progenitor of the early Cimmerians, and other branches of the Celtic family. So the Celts are descended from Gomer. Now, the branches of the Celtic family that moved west from the mountains of Ararat, where Noah's Ark touched ground, the branches of the Celtic family that moved west occupied the southern parts of Western Europe, especially France, Spain, Portugal, and North Italy. So those are the areas that will be in alliance with Gog. They will not be in alliance because they like Gog. They will be in alliance because they've seen what's happened to Germany. And so they will feel obliged to say, well, don't invade us, we'll go with you. So these are the Celtic areas then, of the Gomer areas. France, Spain, Portugal, northern Italy is included. The rest of Italy also will be in alliance with Gog, but that's we'd have to illustrate that from another point. And these other areas, Austria and Austria's there, and these southern areas, these are basically the kind of region that is being referred to in alliance with the Russian Gog. And we also mentioned Libya. As I say, the ancient Libya extended beyond the borders of present-day Libya to include Tunisia, Algeria probably, could go as far as Morocco. Now, Ezekiel's prophecy was at the time, Ezekiel lived at the time of the Babylonian captivity. So you study the history of the Middle East, and nothing like this has happened since then. Since the Babylonian captivity, there's never been an invasion from Russia into the Middle East with the European nations, the mainland European nations, contributing their armed forces to the event. And Iran being with them, and the forces of northern Africa being with them. It's never happened. So it's got to be an end-time prophecy. Reading on, we read verses 5 and 6, verses 7 and 8. We read there, "Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself." This is Ezekiel, or the Spirit through Ezekiel, God speaking through Ezekiel to the future Gog. He's saying to him, "Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them." Yes, the term there, guard, signifies more of a prison guard. He's going to be keeping under control the European nations of the south, having conquered the ones of the north. Verse 8, "After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years," that's now, "thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel." So that's fairly specific. "Which have been always waste," yes, they have, until recent times. "But it is brought forth out of the nations," yes, it is, today. "And they will dwell safely, all of them." Well, of course, they will certainly think they're safe when the Arab nations have been overthrown by divine intervention. They will then feel perfectly safe for a while. Russia, the king of the north, is then drawn down into the Middle East. And we turn to Daniel, a prophecy. There's a lot of end-time prophecy in Daniel. Chapter 11 we're looking at, verse 40, 41. Daniel, in chapter 11, prophesies about a king of the north and a king of the south. Now, you can look at any Bible commentary, and they all agree that initially it was to do with the house of Seleucus fighting against the house of Ptolemy. In other words, once the Greek Empire broke up, one of the Greek generals, Ptolemy, became king of Egypt. Another one became king of Syria, Seleucus. And they and their descendants fought each other continually. And they were the two principal powers in the earth at the time. The king, one was in the north, the other in the south. But then there's a latter-day application. And so verse 40 comes on to the latter-day application of a king of the north and a king of the south. And we can see that it's speaking of the same Russian power from the north that Ezekiel speaks of. So we read verse 40. And at the time of the end, yes, end times, shall the king of the south, this is Egypt, it always was Egypt, but it can't be Egypt as it's presently constituted. It's got to be Egypt with the Tarshish powers, Britain, America, and such English-speaking nations based in Egypt as a kind of military base to defend their interest in the Middle East. That's what is likely to be the case. And at that time shall the king of the south push at him, the king of the north, Gog and his forces. And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots, with horsemen, or the modern day equivalent of chariots, and with many ships. Yes, the Black Sea fleet will be employed. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. And he shall enter also into the glorious land, that's Israel. And many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief part of the children of Ammon. That's the main part of the kingdom of Jordan. For some reason, it's not going to be fully overrun by the Russians, probably because the Tarshish powers will be there. And of course, the main ally of Jordan is Britain. So then, we see how the king of the north must be established in Byzantium, or Constantinople, or Istanbul, as we know it today, to become the king of the north. In other words, Gog has got to take Turkey first and establish himself, his throne, as it were, in Istanbul. Of course, then he controls the Dardanelles. He can get his military ships out of there then through the Dardanelles into the Mediterranean and invade Egypt with the ships. Reading on, verse 42, we read on in verse 42 of Daniel 11, concerning the king of the north, how he shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So notice, he's going to invade Egypt, is the king of the north, with many ships, as it goes on. Verse 43, but he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver and over all the precious things of Egypt. In other words, the antiquities. And this is something that every despot that's taken Egypt has taken a great interest in. Napoleon, when he, for a while, occupied Egypt, he was extremely interested and proud to have under his control the pyramids and the ancient artifacts and the gold and silver that's found in those places, the ancient burial things. And so he shall have power over these things. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians, we've come across these in Ezekiel 38, the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Now that's what Ezekiel said. They shall be his allies. So we're talking about the same invasion here, only it's calling Gog the king of the king of the north. Verse 44, but tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him, no doubt from the Tarshish powers. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy, and utterly to make away many. And he shall plant his tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. That's Mount Zion. There's only one glorious holy mountain on planet Earth. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. In other words, this is a battle of Armageddon. There will, at this point, before he is overthrown, there will be, once he's planted his temporary tabernacles between the seas, that's the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea, in the land of Israel, once Gog has done this, there will be a second exodus from Egypt, because many of the Jews will have fled into Egypt, because Russia is coming down from the north overland to Israel, and also by sea via Egypt. So many Jews, until he invades Egypt, many of the Jews will flee into Egypt, because there the Tarshish powers will be established, America and Britain with their forces. But they'll be trapped, because Gog will drive the Tarshish powers out of Egypt and rule over Egypt like a cruel lord, like Pharaoh did in ancient times, keeping the Jews there in slavery. It'll need a second exodus. So we read Isaiah chapter 19, verse 4. And we read, "And the Egyptians will I give over into the hand of a cruel lord," Gog, in other words, "and a fierce king shall rule over them, saith the Lord of hosts." And reading also in the same chapter, but just considering verse 1, we read there, "The burden of Egypt, behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt. And the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it." This form of the Lord of hosts, Yahweh Sabaoth in the Hebrew, will be Christ and the immortalized believers. They will come from the mountains of Sinai, where they've been having the marriage supper of the Lamb, and they will come into Egypt to deliver the Jews trapped there from the Russian ruler's iron grip as a second exodus. And reading verse 5 of the same chapter of Isaiah, we read how the waters shall fail from the sea, the Red Sea, and the river shall be wasted and dried. We read also in Isaiah 11 and verse 11, we read, "And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people which shall be left, from Assyria and from Egypt, and from Pathros and from Cush," that's Africa, "and from Elam, and from Shinar, and from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea." So there's going to be a second exodus from Egypt, and also they're going to be brought, the Jews, from these other places mentioned, back to the land of Israel. And also in Isaiah 11, reading on, verse 15, "And the Lord shall utterly destroy the tongue of the Egyptian sea." That's the Gulf of Suez, the Red Sea, "and shall smite it in the seven streams, and make men go over." I read that wrong. "And the Lord shall utterly destroy the tongue of the Egyptian sea, and with his mighty wind shall he shake his hand over the river." So he's going to make a highway for the Jews to come back, drying up the Red Sea along the neck of it, so they can walk across, and also the great river Euphrates, so that they can come from Asia down into the Middle East, the Jews, back to the land. And so the Lord shall utterly destroy the tongue of the Egyptian sea, the Red Sea, and with his mighty wind shall he shake his hand over the river Euphrates, and shall smite it in seven streams, that men may go over, they can ford it, they can walk across it. Verse 16, "And there shall be an highway for the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria," that's basically Syria and Iraq today, "like as it was to Israel in the day that they came up out of the land of Egypt." So we have a depiction there on the screen of the Red Sea being parted and the Israelites walking across. Zechariah 10 also says, in verse 10 and 11, "I will bring them again," also that's the Jews, "out of the land of Egypt, and gather them out of Assyria, and I will bring them into the land of Gilead and Lebanon, and place shall not be found for them, because there'll be so many. And he shall pass through," that is Christ in effect, "he shall pass through the sea with affliction." He will pass through the Red Sea, just like Moses did with the children of Israel in the past. "He shall pass through the Red Sea, through the sea with affliction, and shall smite the waves in the sea, and all the deeps of the river also shall be dry. And the pride of Assyria shall be brought down, and the scepter of Egypt shall depart away. And Habakkuk, one of the minor prophets, we read chapter 3, verse 8. Was the Lord displeased against the rivers? That's when he smites the river Euphrates. Was thine anger against the rivers? And was thy wrath against the sea, the Red Sea, that thou didst ride upon thine horses and thy chariots of salvation? Verse 15, thou didst walk through the sea with thine horses, through the heap of great waters. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, and the curtains of the land of Midian. In other words, those are regions round the Red Sea, which will be, anyone there will be very frightened, because there's going to be great geological upheavals to bring about the drying up of the Red Sea. It'll be a permanent drying up, a permanent highway for Jews thereafter to make their way from Africa across the Red Sea into the land of Israel. When Christ brings the Jews out of Egypt, Christ and the immortalized believers, they will march them, as it were, across through the Red Sea and across the Sinai. They will come up into the land of Israel like Joshua did. They will come up from the south through Bozrah, up the eastern side of the Dead Sea. Then they will cross the River Jordan at Jericho, just like Joshua did. Then they'll make a straight course up to Jerusalem to deliver it in the final battle of Armageddon. Quoting from the New King James Version, we read Habakkuk 3, verses 3 and 4. We're still in Habakkuk 3. God came from Teman, that's northern Arabia. The Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah, mark well. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. He had rays flashing from his hand, and there is the power. There his power was hidden. So the power of the Spirit will shine forth through the holes in his hand, the marks of crucifixion. The power will shine forth from there and smite his enemies, smite Gog's forces in the south. Reading still in Habakkuk 3, it's a good chapter to read. Verse 5, before him went the pestilence, and burning coals went forth at his feet. He stood, this is Christ, and the saints with him. He stood and measured the earth, and beheld, and drove asunder the nations in Gog's forces. And the everlasting mountains were scattered, the perpetual hills did bow. His ways are everlasting. And Isaiah 34, verse 6, the sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is made fat with the fatness and with the blood of lambs and goats, figuratively speaking. It's a sacrifice, figurative. With the fat of the kidneys of rams, for the Lord hath a sacrifice in Bozrah. That's where he meets up with Gog's forces in the south. And a great slaughter in the land of Idumea, or Edom. That's a photo, incidentally, of Bozrah. So, looking on the map then, Christ and the saints bring the Jews out of Egypt, across the Red Sea, across the Sinai. They come like Joshua did in this direction. They approach the land from the south and the east. Bozrah is round about here. They meet up with Gog's forces there, defeat them. They continue up to Jericho, cross the River Jordan, and then straight course up to Jerusalem. And that's where we get the climax of the Battle of Armageddon. Remember, Gog, by this time, has planted the tabernacles of his palace between the seas, that's the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea, we read this, in the glorious holy mountain, Mount Zion. And he'll be there with his forces, and Christ will meet up with him there to deliver the Jews that will be left besieged in the old city. So we read Isaiah 63, verse 1. Who is this that cometh from Edom, with dyed garments from Bozrah? This that is glorious in his apparel, travelling in the greatness of his strength. I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save. The dyeing of his garments is dyed with blood. That is the inference. We get this elsewhere. Because he slaughtered so many of the enemy. So I think we are at the point where we need to break and deal with the rest next week, because it's rather a lot to take in and time has gone on. So what we've been looking at today is the fifth order of event, the fifth event, when Christ returns, how Russia, the king of the north, is drawn into the Middle East. And then there is the second exodus of the Jews, conducted by Christ and the saints. And then Christ and the saints, the word saint in the Bible means believer. Someone separated to the belief and service of Christ. All believers, therefore, in the Bible are saints. And Christ and the saints then engage Gog's forces at Bosra. And then they progress after that. So next week, God willing, next week we shall deal with stage 8, 9 and 10. Christ and the saints cross the Jordan from the east. Christ saves the tents of Judah first. In Judah, which is south of Jerusalem, it's a big desert area, the Negev. And apparently some of the Jewish forces, the fighters, will be holding out there. So they will be surrounded by Gog's forces, but they'll be holding out there. So the first thing that Christ will do is to save them. And then they proceed up to Jerusalem. Christ and the saints come and save Jerusalem. But that's next week's subject, God willing. So we shall pause now for any comment, discussion, or whatever. And thank you very much. Okay, so we've already dealt with in the previous two addresses the points 1 to 7. So today we wish to deal with points 8, 9 and 10. And of course, from the list there, it can be seen what we've already looked at, how when Christ returns there will be the resurrection. Those who are raised will be judged. Those who are accepted at the judgment will be clothed with immortality. Point 3, they go to what the book of Revelation calls the marriage supper. And point 4, there is a work to be done of divine work of overthrowing Israel's hostile neighbours who will be overrunning the land of Israel at the time, according to Psalm 83. And then this is followed by an invasion from the north. Point 5, Russia and allies come down into the Middle East, besiege Jerusalem. This is when we get the Armageddon. And point 6, once the forces of Russia are overthrown and their allies, then there will be the things of Christ establishing the kingdom. But first, he will bring the Jews out of Egypt a second time, point 6, because many of the Israelis will have fled there when the Russians came down into the land and got trapped there when the Russians come by sea and invade Egypt, Daniel 11. And then Christ will bring the Jews, Christ and the immortalized believers, bring the Jews across the Sinai quickly to follow the route that Israel took when they first entered the land, to come up through Edom to the east side of the Dead Sea, the east side of the Jordan, then cross the Jordan, and then come up to Jerusalem to deliver it from the Russian forces and allies that will be besieging it. So that is what we've dealt with. Now today we wish to carry on from there. We wish to look at Christ and the saints, that's the immortalized believers, how they will cross the River Jordan from the east. And point 9, Christ saves the tents of Judah first. It says so in Zechariah 14, because there will be some Israelis in Judah in the south that will be holding out against the invasion. So he saves them, they'll be besieged, so to speak. He'll save them, and then they come up to Jerusalem, and they deliver Jerusalem. So that is what we wish to look. We will just recap, though. We will recap a little. So we just look at something we looked at last week. Well, just look stages 5 and 7. Ezekiel 38 verse 2 says, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Prophesy concerning him. We find that Gog When we look at the etymology of the word or name, it signifies a dynamic leader. So it won't be his actual name, but it styles him Gog because he's a dynamic leader. He's Prince of Rosh, which is the ancient name for Russia. Indeed, it's still the modern name in some languages. Meshech is Muscovy, and Tubal is Tobolsky, the Siberian region. And we made a point, as we have at the bottom of the screen there, that Rosh is an ancient name for Russia. And in the Germanic and Scandinavian languages today, they call it Russland. In other words, the land of the Russ or Rosh. And that is what Russia means. That means the land of the Rush as well. So the name has not changed really since it was given in Ezekiel 38 verse 2 in prophecy of the latter days. Still recapping, we left off last time where Christ and the immortalized believers have brought the Jews out of Egypt, and they've walked across the Red Sea, which is dried up, as it says in the prophets. They come to the south, and at Bozrah they meet Gog's forces, advanced forces at Bozrah. This is Bozrah there, and that is where they meet up. And there's a great battle there, so we read of it, for instance, in Isaiah 63 and other of the prophecies. But Isaiah 63 verse 1 says, "Who is this that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Bozrah? This that is glorious in his apparel, travelling in the greatness of his strength. I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save." And if we go on, you see, it is the Lord of hosts. It is in the person of the Lord Jesus. He will come to do this work, and with the saints, believers. So there's a great battle there. Now we carry on now to the next progression. They then come up the east side of the Dead Sea to the River Jordan. They cross the River Jordan, which doubtless will be dried up again for them. And we read there, Hosea 2, "And I will give her vineyards from thence, a prophecy of the restoration of Israel, and the valley of Achor for a door of hope." When they first entered the land and crossed the river, the valley of Achor became a place of curse, because that is when Achan, who took of the forbidden things from Jericho, brought a curse upon Israel, so they stoned him there. We read of that in Joshua. But this time, when Christ comes, it will be a valley of hope. It will lead on to Jerusalem, a door of hope, and shall sing there, as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up out of the land of Egypt. So it will be a repeat, so to speak, of the exodus from Egypt in some respects. And the next point, Christ saves the tents of Judah first. It says so in Zechariah 12, "The Lord also shall save the tents of Judah first, that the glory of the house of David, the royal house, and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem do not magnify themselves against Judah." So they're saved before Jerusalem. But then Jerusalem is to be saved. Now, here we have a modern photograph of the old city of Jerusalem. The old city has a wall all around it. You can see the wall in various parts. This is the Temple Mount, where we have the Dome of the Rock today, and Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the old city extends along these regions here. And in those days, it will be a refuge for the Jews. The Jews will occupy it totally, and they will be besieged there. And the Russian forces and allies will not wish to destroy it because it's a holy place for them. All the Christian holy places there, they will want to keep it as a trophy. So they will starve the Jews out. But before they are starved, Christ and the saints come, and they enter the old city and deliver it from Gog and his forces. And so we read point 10, Christ saves the tents of, Christ and the saints save Jerusalem. Zechariah 12, verses 9 and 10. "And it shall come to pass in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem, And I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications. And they, the Jews in Jerusalem, shall look upon me whom they have pierced, says the Messiah. And they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. So when the Jews see that their Messiah that's come to save them has all the marks of crucifixion, including a mortal wound in the side of his body, the spear wound that was put there, made by the soldier after he expired on the cross. No mortal man could live with such a wound, but this is the glorified immortal Christ. And they will realize he's the one that their forebears had crucified. When they see this, they shall be exceeding sad and will never go astray again. Zechariah 14 tells us that verses 2, 3 and 4, we read, "For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity. The residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city." The residue will be those in the old city, walled up there, which you can see in the distance there. And this is the Mount of Olives here. And we read on verse 3. "Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle." In other words, in biblical times when divine intervention caused Israel to win their wars. Divine intervention will be again active. Miracles will then be done in the earth. Verse 4. "His feet," the Messiah's feet, "shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east." Jesus had a long association with the Mount of Olives. He used to sleep there at night. His friends lived on the far side of the Mount of Olives at Bethany. And he ascended from the Mount of Olives when he ascended to the right hand of the Father. So he will enter. Take a seat anywhere. You're welcome. Yes. Okay, we'll just stop the recording there.